In 1860, they do not exist. By 1880, they control nations. Not one family, not one country, several families, several countries, across an entire continent, simultaneously. The official record explains this. It calls it dynastic marriage, strategic alliance, the natural consolidation of European power. But the official record has a problem. When you go looking for these families before 1820, in church archives, in land registries, in tax rolls, in any document that was not produced after their rise to power, the trail does not thin gradually. It nearly vanishes. And that is only the first inconsistency. Most people who study European history absorb a version of it that feels continuous, a long unbroken chain of dynasties ruling from medieval castles down through the centuries, each one connected to the next by blood and documentation. The names are familiar. The portraits hang in museums. The genealogies are printed in encyclopedias. The lineages, in their official form, appear settled. But the official form is only one layer of the record. Beneath it, a different pattern begins to emerge, one that is harder to explain and harder to dismiss once you have seen it. In the span of roughly 50 years, beginning around 1815 and accelerating sharply through the 1860s and 1870s, something unusual happened to the political map of Europe and several regions beyond it. Nations that had not previously existed as unified states suddenly crystallized. Italy became a unified kingdom in 1861. Germany became a unified empire in 1871. Belgium was created in 1830. Romania consolidated in 1859. Bulgaria emerged as a formal state in 1878. Greece, previously fragmented, gained independence and a throne in 1832. In every single one of these cases, a royal family appeared to fill the vacancy. That part is not disputed. What becomes harder to explain is where those families came from, and how, in multiple unconnected nations across a continent, the same small network of surnames kept appearing. The most documented example is a family originating from a minor duchy in what is now central Germany. The duchy was small. Its political reach, by any pre-19th century measure, was negligible. Its population was modest. Its resources were unremarkable. It had no standing army capable of projecting power, no recorded naval presence, no documented history of continental influence. And yet, by 1900, descendants of this family sat on the thrones of Britain, Belgium, Portugal, Bulgaria, Romania, and held documented ties to the ruling structures of Russia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Greece, and Spain. The official explanation for this is dynastic marriage. Strategic intermarriage across European noble families was common practice, and over generations, bloodlines spread. That part is well documented. It is not the spread itself that is difficult to explain. What remains difficult to explain is the speed, and the timing, and the precision, because in each case, the placement did not unfold gradually over centuries. It happened in a compressed window. A throne became available, often through revolution, war, or the deliberate dismantling of a prior ruling structure. And within months or years, a candidate from this same narrow network was installed, legitimized, and presented to the population as their sovereign. The record begins to show a pattern that looks less like inheritance and more like logistics. Now consider the genealogical documentation itself. For the great ruling houses of Western Europe, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Capetians, the archive trail is dense and extensive. Papal records, land grants, marriage documents, church registrations, military commissions. The documentation stretches back centuries and is largely consistent, cross-referenced, and verifiable across multiple independent sources. For many of the families that rose to power after 1815, the documentation does not behave in the same way. The official genealogies exist. They are printed, cited, and institutionally endorsed. But when researchers attempt to cross-reference them against independent local archives, regional church records, tax rolls, property documents, guild registrations, the trail frequently becomes inconsistent. Documents that should exist in multiple copies across multiple institutions are sometimes found in only one location, or are found only in versions dated after the family's rise to prominence, or reference earlier documents that no longer exist and cannot be located. This is not universal. Some records are solid, but the pattern of thin or reconstructed documentation appears often enough across enough separate cases that it becomes difficult to treat each instance as an isolated archival accident. What most people never notice is that the period of maximum dynastic emergence, roughly 1815 to 1880, coincides precisely with a period of maximum archival disruption. The Napoleonic Wars had moved across Europe like a slow erasure. Records were displaced, destroyed, or confiscated. Administrative systems collapsed and were rebuilt. Municipal archives in dozens of European cities were damaged, reclassified, or simply never fully recovered. In this environment, the reconstruction of a family's deep history became far easier to manage and far harder to independently verify. The official explanation accounts for part of this. Wars destroy things. Archives are lost, but it leaves out the question of who benefited from those losses and who had the institutional means to reconstruct a historical identity in the silence that followed. And then another detail appears. In 1815, following the defeat of Napoleon, the major powers of Europe convened in Vienna. The Congress of Vienna is documented primarily as a peace settlement, a diplomatic renegotiation of borders and power arrangements among the victorious nations. That part is well established. What is discussed less frequently is what else the Congress produced: a comprehensive redesign of legitimate authority across the continent. Thrones were assigned. Territories were redistributed. New political units were sketched. And the families empowered to govern those units were, in every case, drawn from a pre-approved network of names. Families with documented relationships to the small circle of individuals who had organized and presided over the Congress itself. The Congress did not simply end a war. It installed a system, one with designated rulers for territories that had not yet, in many cases, become the nations those rulers would eventually govern. This matters because it reframes the subsequent half-century of European dynastic history. The thrones that appeared to emerge organically from nationalism, revolution, and popular will, the newly unified Italy, the consolidated German Empire, the liberated Balkan states, were not filled randomly. They were filled according to a placement logic that had been sketched, at least partially, decades in advance. The nations were new. The ruling families waiting to govern them were not improvised. Whether that constitutes coordination or simply the practical reality of how power operated among European aristocracies in the 19th century is a question the record does not definitively answer. But the pattern is visible. Go further, and a structural consistency begins to emerge that is harder to attribute to coincidence. When a new throne was created and a dynastic candidate was selected, the process followed a recognizable architecture. A small committee of great powers, almost always drawing on the same 4 or 5 dominant families and their diplomatic intermediaries, would deliberate on candidacies. A name would be proposed. Objections would be managed. The candidate would arrive in the new nation, often having never set foot in it before. A constitution would be drafted around their authority. A national mythology, in many cases, would be constructed or reinforced to give the arrangement historical legitimacy. The populations of these nations were not passive in this process. Genuine nationalist movements existed. Genuine desire for self-determination was real. But in nearly every case, the movement that produced national liberation was followed, almost immediately, by the installation of a foreign dynastic figure to govern the liberated nation. What remains difficult to explain is why nationalist movements that had fought for independence from foreign rule consistently ended by inviting a different foreign family to sit at their center. And why that family, in case after case, came from the same narrow network. The institutional logic, if you follow it carefully, suggests that the nationalism and the dynasty were not separate phenomena. They may have been coordinated components of the same process. The nation provided legitimacy. The dynasty provided the administrative and financial architecture that the nation, newly formed and structurally fragile, could not build alone. The arrangement suited both sides. The record reflects the outcome, not the mechanism. And the mechanism, in most national histories, is not discussed. There is a final detail that belongs here. Several of the families that rose to prominence in this period, placed on new thrones, granted legitimacy by the Congress powers, presented with reconstructed genealogies, had documented relationships to the same private banking networks that were, during precisely this period, extending credit to the newly forming nation-states. The loans were real. They are in the financial record. New nations needed infrastructure, armies, administrative systems, and debt instruments to build them. The banking relationships that provided that financing were structured, in most cases, before the nations themselves were formally constituted. This means that in at least several documented instances, the financial architecture of a nation was in place before the nation existed. The lending relationships preceded the borders. The debt preceded the government. And the families at the center of both the dynastic placements and the financial networks were, in the documented record, overlapping. That might be coincidence. A small aristocratic world in which banking, politics, and marriage had always been entangled. The official record does not suggest anything beyond that. But the structure that emerges, when you lay the documentation against the timeline, is not the structure of organic historical development. It is the structure of something that was, at least in part, assembled. The dynasties exist. The nations exist. The documents exist. The debts were paid. The thrones were filled. The genealogies were printed and accepted and taught. What does not exist, or does not exist in any form that is publicly accessible, is a clear record of the deliberations behind the placements, the private correspondence, the internal negotiations, the discussions that produced the list of names that would govern the next century of European history. Some of that correspondence is held in private family archives, not subject to public record requests. Some was reportedly destroyed. Some was never written down, because the people involved understood that certain agreements are more durable when they leave no formal trace. The nations that emerged from this period are still governed, in many cases, by constitutional structures that were built during this window. The financial relationships established in the 1840s and 1860s created institutional frameworks that persisted across generations. The families placed on those thrones remained in ceremonial or actual power, in several cases, for over a century. And the documentation gap, the thin archive before 1820, the reconstructed genealogies, the missing correspondence, remains exactly as it was. The history of this period has been written. It is taught in universities, cited in encyclopedias, reproduced in documentary films and national curricula. But the history that was written and the process that produced it are not the same thing. And the closer you look at the record, the more clearly you can see the outline of something that has never been fully explained, or, perhaps, fully examined.